Momo had always been a name whispered in the dark, passed along in hushed tones, like a chilling secret. Those who dared speak it in broad daylight felt a shiver run down their spine, and those who were brave enough to seek the creature's origins found their lives altered forever. It wasn't just a name, it was a curse, a warning, and for those who believed in it, the name held terrifying weight. Rumors of Momo's existence had started like all legends do, gradually. First, in small towns, it was just a folklore tale parents used to scare their children into behaving. But the story began to grow. People started disappearing. At first, the disappearances were isolated. A local baker here, a schoolteacher there, but then it became harder to ignore. Entire families were vanishing overnight, and the authorities couldn't explain it. No bodies were ever found. No clues left behind. Just empty homes. And soon, whispers started to circulate that Momo was behind it all. Momo, a creature neither fully human nor fully beast, was said to haunt the darkest parts of the world, the places where light couldn't reach, and fear thrived. With a face twisted into an eerie, unsettling smile, Momo's eyes were said to glow in the night like pale, hollow lanterns, always watching, always waiting. Some said she was an ancient spirit, cursed by the gods, others believed she was a creature born of darkness itself, a spirit of revenge against humankind. There was no consensus on what she truly was, but there was one thing everyone agreed on: no one who encountered her ever returned. It was in the small town of Ashwood where the story of Momo would take its darkest turn. A young man named Jacob had always been a skeptic. He dismissed the rumors as mere superstition, something to keep children awake at night or to add a bit of thrill to a slow, rural town. But that was before he stumbled upon something he couldn't explain. Jacob had lived in Ashwood all his life, and like most of the townsfolk, he had heard the stories of Momo. They were just stories, he thought. Something to scare people into behaving. It wasn't until he started dating Sarah, a girl with a deep fascination for the unknown, that things began to change. Sarah was different from everyone Jacob had ever met. She wasn't afraid of the dark corners of the world, she was drawn to them. And when she heard the stories about Momo, she became obsessed. "Jacob, you don't get it," Sarah would say, her eyes wide with excitement whenever the topic came up. "This isn't just a myth. Momo is real. We need to find her." Jacob thought it was a joke at first. He laughed it off, trying to steer their conversations to something more sensible. But Sarah's obsession deepened. She read books, researched old folklore, and dug into local history, piecing together stories from survivors who claimed to have seen Momo. Each tale was different, but they all had one thing in common: Momo always came when least expected, and she came for people who sought her out. Jacob tried to ignore it. He had always believed that the supernatural was just that, supernatural, unexplainable, but not real. That was until Sarah disappeared. It was a crisp fall evening when she decided to go out on her own, convinced that she had found the place where Momo's spirit resided. It was an old abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a place long abandoned and rumored to be cursed. Despite Jacob's protests, Sarah insisted on going, and when she didn't return by morning, Jacob knew something had gone terribly wrong. At first, the town rallied together to search for her, but the search quickly turned up nothing. No signs of struggle. No footprints. No indication that Sarah had ever even been there. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. The more they searched, the more the dark legend of Momo began to feel less like myth and more like truth. Days passed, and Jacob's grief turned to desperation. He couldn't shake the feeling that Momo had something to do with Sarah's disappearance. The reports of similar disappearances over the years started to make sense. Something was wrong with Ashwood, and Momo was at the heart of it. Unable to let go, Jacob ventured out to the house where Sarah had gone missing. It was the same house he had once thought was just a relic of an old, forgotten time. The windows were boarded up, and the roof had collapsed in places, leaving gaps where the moonlight crept in like thin, pale fingers. As he walked closer, the air grew thick with an almost tangible unease. The wind seemed to stop, and the night felt unnaturally still. He took a deep breath and pushed open the creaky front door. Inside, the air smelled stale, like old wood and rot. The dust on the floor had not been disturbed in years, and the silence was deafening. But as Jacob stepped further inside, he felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. His skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Sarah?" His voice echoed through the empty house, but there was no response. He continued to explore, driven by a mixture of fear and hope. The house seemed to stretch on forever, with hallways that twisted unnaturally and rooms that felt too small for the size of the house. It wasn't long before Jacob found the basement door, half hidden behind a rotting bookcase. With a mixture of dread and determination, he descended the creaky stairs. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and the air was thick with something foul. In the far corner, something shimmered in the darkness, two glowing eyes, pale and sickly, watching him. And then, just as he had begun to make sense of the figure, the creature spoke. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice smooth and honeyed, but carrying an edge of malice. Jacob froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure stepped into the faint moonlight. The creature was tall, impossibly thin, its skin as pale as bone. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a human, with a mouth too wide to be real and eyes that shone like lanterns in the dark. But it was the smile that chilled Jacob to his core, an expression that didn't belong to anything human. "Momo," Jacob gasped, his voice a strangled whisper. The creature smiled wider, its sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. "Yes, I am she. And now, you are mine." The world around Jacob seemed to warp and twist as Momo stepped closer, her hollow eyes never leaving his. He tried to move, but his body felt frozen, as if the very air had thickened around him. Momo reached out, and with a chilling touch, she traced her fingers along his cheek. "You've seen too much," she murmured, her breath like ice on his skin. "But it's too late to turn back." Jacob felt his heart race faster, his breath quickening, but no matter how hard he tried, his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed, trapped in the nightmare that had consumed Sarah, and countless others before her. "She's gone," Momo said softly, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. "And soon, you will be too. I am everywhere. I am the dark, the shadows, the silence between breaths. And I will always be watching." In that moment, Jacob understood the truth. Momo was no mere creature of flesh and bone. She was an ancient force, a manifestation of the fear and darkness that haunted the hearts of men. And she would never let him leave. As the darkness consumed him, Jacob's final thought was a chilling realization: Momo didn't just take bodies. She took souls. And in the end, she would take everything. The next morning, the search party returned to the house. But all they found was an empty, silent home, just like Sarah's. As the days passed, Ashwood was gripped by an unsettling sense of dread. Jacob had vanished without a trace, just like Sarah. The townspeople began to whisper louder, their fear turning to terror. The parents kept their children indoors, locking doors and windows, praying that Momo wouldn't come for them next. The local authorities, baffled by the inexplicable disappearances, began to investigate deeper into the town's history, uncovering more chilling details about the creature they had once dismissed as nothing more than folklore. But it was too late. The people of Ashwood were already feeling the pull of Momo's darkness. It wasn't just a creature that lurked in shadows anymore, it was a presence. It hung in the air, in the spaces between words, in the empty gaze of anyone who had seen the horror and survived. And no one could escape it. Maya, a childhood friend of Jacob's, had always known the stories. But she was different from the others in Ashwood. While the rest of the town cowered, Maya had always been one to seek answers. The disappearance of her friends, Sarah, then Jacob, was unbearable, and she couldn't stop herself from wondering if there was something more to Momo than just a terrifying myth. She refused to believe that the town's legends were the end of it. Something was lurking in the shadows of this small, cursed place, and Maya wasn't going to rest until she uncovered the truth. Late one night, unable to sleep, Maya sat at her desk with a pile of old books in front of her, books about the occult, creatures of myth, and the dark history of Ashwood. She read through pages and pages of information, digging for anything that might shed light on the origins of Momo. As the hours slipped away, her eyes grew heavy, and she began to lose hope. But then, a single line from an old, tattered journal caught her attention. She who haunts the darkest corners of the world is not born from flesh, but from the fear of flesh itself. To seek her is to lose your soul, to face your deepest, darkest fear, and to be consumed by it forever. Maya's heart skipped a beat. The passage seemed to be describing the exact nature of what had happened to Jacob and Sarah. They had both sought Momo out, and in doing so, they had fallen prey to their own fears, fears they couldn't even understand. But there was more. Maya kept reading, her fingers trembling as she turned the brittle pages. It was then that she came across the mention of a ritual, a way to summon Momo. The ancient texts spoke of a ritual that could summon her, but it came at a terrible price. The creature was not merely a predator. She was a reflection of the darkness within each person, a force that only gained power when fear was invoked. The ritual required an offering, a sacrifice of someone who had faced their deepest terror and succumbed to it. Once the ritual was complete, Momo would appear, her power growing, and the person who had summoned her would either be devoured or enslaved, depending on the nature of their fear. Maya's heart raced. Could the people of Ashwood have unknowingly performed the ritual over the years? Had their fear, passed from generation to generation, fed Momo's hunger for so long that she had become a part of the very fabric of their town? The room grew colder, and Maya shuddered. It wasn't the wind, no, this was something else. Something was watching her. Something was waiting for her to understand. She slammed the book shut, her thoughts spiraling into terror. There had to be a way to stop it. But how could one fight a creature born of fear? The more Maya thought, the more she realized the truth. Momo wasn't just a monster in the dark, she was the dark, the living embodiment of everything that people feared but couldn't name. And as long as people feared her, she would always exist. Determined to save Ashwood, Maya set out to find the house where Sarah had disappeared. She had to know where it all began, where Momo had first been summoned into their world. The journey was long and fraught with unease. As she approached the house, the wind seemed to die down completely. The trees lining the dirt path twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching out like hands grasping for her. The house stood before her, rotting, dilapidated, its windows like hollow eyes watching her every move. She had never seen it in daylight before, and the stark contrast between day and night was enough to make her stomach churn. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. But Maya pressed on, determined to face whatever evil had taken hold of her town. As she stepped inside, the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. She could almost hear whispers in the air, soft and unintelligible, as if the house itself was alive. Maya moved through the house with careful steps, every creak and groan of the old wood making her jump. There were no signs of life, only the stench of decay. She descended into the basement, where she knew Momo had been. The air was thick with an unnatural chill as Maya reached the bottom of the stairs. And then, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it, a figure standing motionless in the corner. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but no, it was Momo, her pale eyes glowing faintly in the shadows, her smile wide and predatory. "You shouldn't have come," Momo's voice echoed through the basement, low and taunting. Maya stood frozen. There was something in her eyes, something that made her want to run, but she couldn't. Her legs felt like they were made of stone. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am Fear," Momo replied, her voice like a hiss in the dark. "I am what you hide from, what you refuse to face. I am the part of you that you can't name but always feel. And now, you have come to me. You are the next offering, Maya. No. Maya gasped, taking a step back. I won't be your prey. You can't make me afraid. Momo's laugh was a sound that echoed through Maya's bones. I am fear, child. And fear is what I feed on. You think you can escape me? You think you can deny what's inside of you? Momo's smile grew wider, more grotesque. We all have our demons, Maya. It's just a matter of whether you choose to face them, or let them consume you. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls narrowing, the shadows creeping in from all sides. And suddenly, Maya saw it, the darkness that Momo spoke of. Her own fear, her deepest terror, was staring back at her. She saw herself, trembling, broken, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. It was her. She was the one who had always hidden from her past, from the guilt and sorrow that had haunted her for years. The fear of failure, of losing everything she held dear, was now staring back at her, manifesting into something real. You. Maya whispered, her voice cracking. You are my fear. You're me. Momo's smile twisted into something more sinister. Yes. You finally understood. The more you run from your fear, the stronger I become. I am part of you. And now, you will join me. Forever. The darkness enveloped her, pulling her into its cold, suffocating embrace. The world around her faded, leaving nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her chest. She had lost. Just like Jacob. Just like Sarah. Maya screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Momo's laughter echoed in her ears, and for the first time, Maya understood what it meant to truly fear. In the morning, the town would find another empty house. Another disappearance. And the legend of Momo would continue, feeding on the darkest corners of their souls, as it always had. Because Momo wasn't just a creature. She was the fear that lived inside them all. And as long as that fear remained, she would never be gone. The days after Maya's disappearance passed in a blur for the town of Ashwood. The search for her, much like the search for Jacob and Sarah before her, came to nothing. The townsfolk tried to carry on with their daily routines, but an invisible weight had settled over the community, pressing down on their shoulders, squeezing the joy out of every passing moment. They could no longer look at the woods surrounding the town without a sense of dread gnawing at them. The old house on the edge of Ashwood, where Momo had claimed its victims, seemed to loom larger now, a dark monument to their collective fear. No one dared go near it anymore, yet its presence haunted their thoughts, like a whisper just out of earshot. But Momo wasn't finished. Her hunger was insatiable, and the shadows she cast were growing longer, more oppressive. As the townspeople slept, their dreams were invaded by visions, images of the lost, their faces contorted in terror as they were drawn into the darkness. And each night, as the moon climbed higher, the darkness grew stronger. It wasn't long before more strange occurrences began to happen, small things at first, things that were easy to dismiss. A door that had been locked was found ajar. Children waking up in the middle of the night, crying that they saw someone standing in the corner of their room. A woman hearing footsteps behind her as she walked home, only to find no one there when she turned around. But then came the nightmares. The townsfolk began to speak in hushed tones about dreams they had started having, dreams where they were all trapped in a never-ending forest, their feet sinking into the earth, unable to escape the thick, choking fog. In these dreams, they would see Momo, her twisted smile growing as she circled closer, her eyes glowing with that same haunting, pale light. It was always the same, they would run, but she would always find them. And just when they thought they might escape, they would wake up, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. And the next day, the world felt a little more oppressive, a little more suffocating. One of the few who had yet to succumb to the creeping fear was an elderly woman named Rose, who had lived in Ashwood her entire life. Rose was the town's unofficial historian. She was one of the few left who could remember the earliest stories of Momo, when the creature was nothing more than a whispered ghost story told around campfires. But as the decades passed, the stories grew darker, more vivid. Rose had lived through many things, from fires to floods, but she had never witnessed anything as terrifying as the force that now held Ashwood in its grip. One night, after hearing the latest disappearance and finding her neighbors whispering more urgently, Rose decided to confront the curse head-on. She had long suspected that there was a connection between Momo and the ancient history of Ashwood, something buried in the past that could explain the creature's rise. As the town slept, Rose gathered her belongings, a few old journals, and set out for the house. Rose had always been a woman of reason, her mind sharp even in her twilight years. The presence of Momo could not be written off as mere myth or madness. Something in the very fabric of Ashwood was feeding this creature, and Rose intended to find the source of it. She had heard the stories, she had lived through the fear, but it was time to uncover the truth. The night was eerily quiet as she made her way through the woods, the path to the house barely visible in the dim light. The trees seemed to lean in toward her, their twisted limbs reaching out like fingers. The house stood at the end of the path, its silhouette dark against the starless sky. It seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, its very presence oppressive. Rose didn't hesitate. She approached the house and pulled open the creaky door. The air inside was damp, thick with the smell of decay. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she moved deeper into the heart of the house. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her from the shadows. Finally, she reached the basement. The door was slightly ajar, and the darkness beyond seemed to beckon her in, promising answers, but at what cost? Rose's heart raced, but she forced herself to move forward. Her footsteps were heavy as she descended into the cold, oppressive basement, the walls closing in around her. And then she saw it. Momo stood in the far corner, her pale eyes glowing in the darkness. Her twisted smile stretched across her face, and her long, unnaturally thin fingers twitched as if they were reaching for Rose. The creature's form seemed to shimmer in the dim light, flickering in and out of focus like a mirage, but there was no mistaking it. It was Momo, the Momo. "You shouldn't have come," Momo hissed, her voice echoing off the stone walls. Rose felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. She wasn't afraid, not now. She had spent her life researching the strange history of this place, and she was certain she knew what had to be done. "Momo, you are nothing but a shadow," Rose said, her voice steady. "A creation of fear. You are a reflection of the darkness inside this town, fed by its fears, its regrets, its secrets." Momo tilted her head, a mocking glint in her eyes. "Oh, Rose," she crooned, her smile widening. "You think you can defeat me with words? I am fear, and fear is all-consuming. You cannot escape me." Rose took a step forward, her hand gripping the worn pages of an ancient journal she had brought with her. "I don't need to defeat you. I just need to expose you. You're not a god, Momo. You're a parasite. You feed on fear, but it's not your power that's keeping this town in darkness, it's their belief in you." Momo laughed, a sound like dry leaves being crushed beneath a boot. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong. I am the darkness. I am the fear that has always been here, lying beneath the surface. You cannot defeat me because you've already lost. They've all lost." But Rose was prepared. She began to chant words in a forgotten language, ancient and almost lost to time, words that spoke to the deepest parts of the human soul. They were the words of a long-dead mystic who had once sought to banish creatures like Momo. As she spoke, a light began to glow in the palm of her hand, a faint, golden glow that seemed to push back the shadows. The walls of the basement trembled, and the air crackled with an electric charge. Momo recoiled, her twisted form flickering, like a shadow struggling against the light. Her smile faltered, and for the first time, Rose saw a flicker of something that wasn't malicious: fear. You think you can banish me? Momo's voice was a strangled hiss now, more frantic. You think you can undo what has been done? The fear will never leave. It's already inside of them. It's already inside of you. The creature lunged forward, but Rose raised her hand, the light growing brighter, hotter, until it seemed to swallow everything in its path. Momo shrieked, a sound that could have shattered glass, as she was forced back into the shadows, her form breaking apart, dissolving like smoke. Rose didn't stop chanting. She could feel the creature's presence weakening, its hold on Ashwood loosening, as the light grew brighter still, casting long, stretching beams through the darkness. It was working. But then, just as Rose thought victory was within her grasp, something shifted. A deep, unsettling sensation crawled up her spine. The light began to flicker. The words, once powerful and clear, became distorted, their meaning twisting in her mind. Her hand trembled as she tried to hold the light steady, but it was fading, slipping away like sand through her fingers. In a final, desperate move, Rose attempted to finish the incantation. But it was too late. Momo's presence, though weakening, was still there. The creature's laugh echoed again, this time, filled with dark amusement. It wasn't defeated. It wasn't gone. No, it had changed. The shadows in the room began to move again, wrapping themselves around Rose, pulling her into a cold, suffocating embrace. She could feel the darkness seeping into her soul, spreading like oil over her thoughts. And then, she understood. It wasn't fear that Momo fed on. It was the belief in fear. And Rose had made a fatal mistake. Before she could even cry out, the darkness consumed her whole, and the house fell silent once again. When morning broke over Ashwood, the townspeople found the house empty, as it always was. But Rose's journals, the old books she had brought, were scattered across the floor, their pages torn and weathered. The town, unaware of the truth, carried on with their lives, some with growing fear, others with growing indifference. But in the shadows, Momo watched, waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next time the darkness inside them would whisper her name. Because, after all, she wasn't going anywhere.